Ooh, ah, Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. Today, I'm on episode 130. We're talking about what is a healthy forest. So, as always, thank you for tuning in, whether you're watching on YouTube with the video version or listening on your favorite podcatcher app to the audio version. Your questions help me shape this show, and I've gotten some questions in the past about healthy forestry and what comprises a healthy forest. What does that actually mean? And that's really where this show comes from today. First, a little bit of business. Those questions that were submitted via the website at www.lumberupdate.com. Did I just date myself by putting the www in front of it? Yeah, I think I just showed my age there. Anyway, go to lumberupdate.com. You can fill out the form to submit your questions, or you can email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com or find me on Instagram at lumberupdateshow. And speaking of Instagram, I have a guest tonight that I actually found on Instagram. What do you know? The little algorithm does work from time to time. Every now and then it shows you something that you actually want to see. And in this case, I ran across a website called healthyforests.org. And well, to answer the question about what is a healthy forest, I thought, you know what? These people might know what they're talking about. So I started going through the website a little bit. I certainly came to them from their Instagram, and I actually saw a post on Instagram that was really compelling. Basically, it showed kind of a split screen of a managed forest and an unmanaged forest before and after a fire. And the total devastation of the unmanaged forest as compared to the barely looks like a fire came through of the managed forest was really telling. And this was also underscored when I recently went out to South Dakota. And I was in Custer State Park, and we were driving around, and literally one side of the road had gone through forest thinning and cleanup, and the other side of the road hadn't, I'm hoping, yet. And on the clean side, you could see like large piles of brush that had been pulled down the hillside, and the forest itself, well, it looked clean. It looked like someone come along and sweep things out. You could see where some trees had been felled, a lot of underbrush had been pulled out, and it was a nice, lovely, grassy, undergrowth and some daylight making it down to the forest floor, a little bit of space between the trees. Whereas the other side that I'm just going to assume they hadn't gotten to yet had all kinds of standing dead trees. Those are also called snags, lots of like really dense undergrowth that, as we'll find out in this interview, that undergrowth, that's just an accelerator. It's kindling, if you will, and it allows the fire to spread. Those tall snags actually are ladder accelerators. The fire shoots right up them, and it takes the fire up to the tops of the trees. And you might remember in the past, I've talked about how certain species are fire propagating. So when the fire comes in, it actually causes their seed cones to open and reseed. So that only works where if the whole tree doesn't burn down, or the tough bark and the branches way up high that stay out of the reach of the fire. Well, if the fire climbs up one of those snags up the ladder and just takes out the canopy, you get real problems. The seeds may open, but if they're burnt on their way to dropping to the floor, or all the needles and leaves and things are burned away, that's a totally different issue. So long story short, I reached out to the executive director of Healthy Forest, and it's a .org organization. So a little bit of digging really I was able to find the right people to talk to, and it turns out Nick Smith is the executive director. He also happens to be the host of the American Forest Research Council podcast as well. So I knew Nick knew his way around a podcast mic and would make an excellent guest. So without further ado, let's bring Nick onto the show and let's learn about a healthy forest. So I have a special guest with me today, Nick Smith, who is the, I think, executive director is your official fancy title of Healthy Forests. Welcome, Nick.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is an interesting one. I came across healthyforest.org through Instagram. It actually works. It was suggested to me on my Lumber Update account, and there was a very compelling image of it's kind of a four-part grid of managed forests and an unmanaged forest after a fire. So before the fire and after the fire, and it was shocking. Like, I know this in my heart, and I was like, "Whoa, where is this coming from?" And I was clicking back and looking through websites, and here was healthyforest.org, and I found this email address. And boom, I emailed Nick, and Nick, you must have gotten back to me within minutes. You must have just been sitting in front of your computer. So, what I really wanted to do, I've had so many conversations, so many questions about like healthy forest. What makes a healthy forest? So here's a guy who works for an organization where healthy forest is the name of it. So I guess let's start there, Nick. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up where you are now.
So I started Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities back in 2013. So this was over 10 years ago. And I come from, well, first of all, I guess my story starts with the fact that I come from a multi-generational natural resource family. My great-great-grandfather was a logger. My great-grandfather was a farmer. Grandfather was a farmer. My dad was a farmer. And so, natural resources is in my blood. And I had, prior to starting Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities, I worked on public policy and communications in the Oregon legislature. And so combining my love for natural resources and my policy and communications background, I started Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities. And the reason why I did that is because at the time, as I spoke with people in the natural resource community, especially the forestry and wood products world, there really wasn't a space or a concerted effort to talk about the need for active forest management, talk about the solutions that exist for the greatest threat to our forests, which are severe wildfire, insects, and disease. And Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities, I think, filled a void in terms of getting folks, perhaps in timber communities, engaged in federal forest management, where, especially in the Northwest, where, we're now 30, 40 years, past the timber wars. There's a lot of apathy, I think, to a large extent, that continues to this day in terms of the management of the vast amount of federal forest lands that are in the Northwest and throughout the West. And so, it was an opportunity to inform and activate people around forest management issues. And second, you mentioned social media, and it just tickles me that you found Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities through Instagram, in that at the time, back in 2013, there weren't many pro-forestry voices on social media. Of course, the anti-forestry forces, in being as sophisticated as they are, really embraced, these social media tools to inform and activate, their own, supporters. And so social media was an opportunity to, get information out there unfiltered by the news media directly to people. And, the benefits of social media is that it's an opportunity not just to tell folks about these important issues. It's an opportunity to show them. And, words obviously are very powerful, but images, video, photography really tell the story of the crisis that we're in terms of having millions of acres of very unhealthy forests and to show what active forest management really looks like. And so, here we are, more than 11 years later. Healthy forests, healthy communities continues to exist to get that information out there and to promote conversations among the public and among policymakers about what we need to do to get more work done on the ground. I would say looking back to 2013, there wasn't much discussion that I could find about active management on social media. Really not much, not a whole lot in the public policy making space. And since then, I think you've seen, a lot of attention, a lot of investments being made, by the federal government to bring forest management back to the forefront. Obviously, lots of obstacles still exist to getting more work done on the ground, but I'd like to think that healthy forests, healthy communities played a small part in that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're spot on that 10 years ago, let's see, how long have I officially been in the lumber industry? 15 years, I guess. And I can remember, like, one of the first things that I did, I work for, if not the oldest, probably the oldest lumber company in the country. We were founded before it was a country. And I remember doing a lot of historical, like, digging through our ledgers and through everything, trying to document the history of the company. And frankly, I was building a website at the time. And there was so much negativity around management of forests. And of course, you dig in, you go in far enough back, and yeah, there's no question we did things wrong a long time ago when we started denuding forests and there was just this total land grab and all that. But I'm looking at it now and I'm seeing, like, greater inventory available than there was even back then. And I have actual historical records, and I have actually sales ledgers from the late 1800s that show, like, volumes are higher today, both being sold, but also near inventory and far inventory through all the mills and the concession managers that we work with. And yet nobody was talking about it. It was all just very vilified. Leave everything alone, leave everything alone. And legislation was very much the same way. Like, here's another national monument. Here's another national park. Here's a state park. And the tactic was leave it alone. And, for better or for worse, I think wildfires have really freaked a lot of people out. We've had some horrible ones. I've got a lot of family in Colorado, and I remember several of the fires that got real close. Like, this wasn't even WUI. This, for those listening, Wildland Urban Interface, WUI. This wasn't WUI. This was urban. This was coming down the hillside, or up the hillside, I should say, and touching Colorado Springs, Manitou Springs, right there in their backyard. And my mom lived in Colorado Springs for several decades and was a real estate agent and lost 4 properties she was listing, like, right smack in the middle of Manitou, which is, a stone's throw from, I'm going to do air quotes for downtown Colorado Springs. There's not a whole lot of downtown to it, but still, that was the center of town. I got a lot of friends out in your neck of the woods, out in the Pacific Northwest. Same situation, like smack in the middle of Portland, and like they can see flames. Not only that, just air quality and all that stuff we were out in Maryland. We had air quality issues from Alberta fires, like north and on the other side of the continent practically. And certainly it is that loss of property, loss of homes, and loss of life that has kind of brought it to the forefront. But suddenly there's all these studies from 25 years ago, 30 years ago from the U.S. Forest Service saying, we got to do something or this is going to be a problem. And guess what? It's a problem now. So, there are people who are constituents who are like, what the hell? I lost my house. Fix this. And legislators are like, well, what do? We need to find a problem. And the U.S. Forest Service is like, here's a report. It's 30 years old, but it's still accurate. And then suddenly it's like, well, hey, the people in the know have been saying this for a while. It's just the people making the policies, or nobody was really pushing hard enough. So this is a very roundabout way of saying I completely agree. The landscape in the last 10 years is massive. And as a marketing director, really, for, an evil lumber company, our message is so much better received. I talk to designers and builders and architects, and I talk to a lot of lobbyists, and they're so much more open to hearing about concession management, and which is essentially forestry management when you talk about it, and what do we do because we just lost all these trees. And call me a capitalist, but I love the trees as much as the next guy, but I lost a lot of inventory. And not me, like the sawmill that I purchased from is now out of business. And I've seen this left and right. We've got mill relationships that go back 60, 70 years, and they've closed their doors. And some of it is financial hardship. Other times it's just, look, I'm tired. Like, I can't do this anymore. I'm like fighting an uphill battle all the time. So, like you say, things are definitely better. Or at least people are open to it, but I still think there's a long, long way to go to kind of get a handle on this.
I agree. And, it really is an industry that has paid dearly for its mistakes in the past, in the distant past.
Yeah. We've done our penance, though, I think.
Well, in truth, absolutely. I absolutely agree. When you learn more about active forest management, when you learn about the science, all of the science, the decades of science that underpin active forest management, your mind changes, quickly.
Sure.
And the problem that we have faced over the past past 50 years is, especially when it comes to federal land management, is that these forests, these publicly owned forests that are owned by you and I and your listeners in the United States, is that they're not managed under the best available science. They're managed by politics. And, for better or worse, forest policy is shaped by politicians,
Sure.
Our elected representatives. And, going back to 19th century forest practices, which, did leave, quite a bad legacy for the industry. It was very difficult for us to recover from. And then, you go to the 60s Earth Day, the 70s, 80s, right into the timber wars. It was really easy for anti-forestry groups to really present their messages as bumper stickers.
Yeah, right.
It's very simple for, a lot of members of the public and policymakers to think that, well, yeah, we really shouldn't be doing anything in the forests. We should, put arbitrary lines on a map and simply walk away and expect, these forests to, do fine, let Mother Nature take its course. But that's just not the reality that we're in today in 2024.
No, that's a particularly interesting point. I'm sorry to interrupt you because I was actually just listening. Folks, if you don't know, Nick also hosts a podcast, the American Forest Resource Council podcast. And I was listening to a couple episodes over the last week, and I actually just listened to your most recent one, the professor from University of Oregon, I believe, about indigenous.
Oregon State, yes.
Yeah, Oregon State. Indigenous practices. So the biggest pushback I hear, I talk about, healthy forestry and forestry management, thinning of forest and things like that. And people are like, well, no, we should just leave it alone and let Mother Nature run its course. That's exactly what you just said. Why doesn't that work? Like, why shouldn't that work? And this professor you had on, Eisenberg, I think was her name. I don't know why I remember that.
Yeah.
She was saying, well, the indigenous peoples in these tribes have been managing these forests for centuries. But I look at that and I think, well, how is that possible? Like, you small number of people in a tribe and millions and millions and millions and millions of square feet of square miles of forest. Wasn't that kind of like leave it alone? And I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. So let me get to the direct question. Why doesn't just leaving the forest alone work? Why can't Mother Nature take care of it on her own? That sounds terrible. She can probably do just fine, but
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there.
sure, I know
But
it's a loaded question.
I think what you're getting at is a really fundamental question,
Right.
that is behind all of the debates behind federal forest management, and that is the question of, do we belong in the forest? Are we a part of the forest?
Right.
And so, that question separates people from, no, we're not part of the forest. We shouldn't be part of the forest. And those who think, well, actually, we're on this planet. We've been managing forests as human beings for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. And so, it's really interesting to listen to the tribal perspective, in that, these are folks obviously with a very tragic history, but folks people who have been in the forest for a lot longer than
Right.
we have in this country, in this part of the hemisphere. And it's interesting to hear their perspective, because it's very different from the policy debates that we've been a part of for the past 30, 40 years. The concept that you could simply put arbitrary lines on a map and just simply walk away is completely foreign to that tribal perspective. And so I think there's a lot to gain from listening to that indigenous perspective and bringing some of that knowledge back and some of those practices in to get out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves over this past half century almost.
Yeah, I guess the big issue is, it would be nice to be able to boil it down that simply and say, do we belong in the forests, yay or nay? And here's an example of a people, many peoples, tribes that have, they've always been in the forest, but we have industry, homes continue to be built. And from my perspective, that's a great thing. First of all, greatest solution to climate change is plant more trees, right? Well, we can't just keep planting trees without taking some of them down. And we can't just stop industry. Like, the Industrial Revolution happened, folks. It's move on. There are homes everywhere. Maybe there are a lot of homes. Maybe we have a population density problem. All of these things are legit, but you can't just say that's the problem. You have to be able to deal with the hand that we have now. And there is a hell of a lot of industry and a lot of trade, a lot of livelihoods that are based in cutting down trees and turning them into boards to build homes, to do hardwood floors, all that fun stuff. And that, I think, needs to continue because it promotes using sustainable materials instead of steel and things that require all kinds of fossil fuels to get to it, that don't grow on trees, literally. So it's kind of like we're in this situation where, sure, it would be nice to say, let's live in harmony with the forest. And I think an indigenous group can say that because maybe their pull is not that high. They're not harvesting huge amounts of trees in order to feed the national home buying market. And that's really where things kind of get difficult. Plus, then you've got those of us who aren't, I don't want to say not living in harmony with the trees, but you've got that whole wooey side of things. You've got these beautiful homes built in amongst the forest and there's massive property at risk. You've got an interface right into the cities that could drive a fire right into the smack in the middle of the city and into a park or something like that. These are things that have to be navigated. So I guess from your perspective today, well, let's start up. Actually, let me hit my notes here. What is a healthy forest? Like, let's define that to start from, and then maybe we can work backwards from there.
Well, sure. So, in my mind, a healthy forest is one that is resilient to disturbance and one that is capable of providing a multitude of benefits to people and wildlife. A healthy forest often is one that has a diverse mix of young, old, and middle-aged forests. And in many forest types, a healthy forest is one that has trees that are spaced out in a way that allows sunshine and precipitation to reach the forest floor. Healthy forests, especially out here in the West, are often described as park-like, where you have where trees are spaced out. Um, Trees have the soil and nutrients to grow big and strong, and one that is able to sustain itself. You had made the comment earlier that we should live in harmony with Mother Nature, and I think for active forest management is the way we live in harmony with these forest ecosystems.
Sure.
A big problem in the policy debate over forest management, especially on federal lands, is this notion that forest ecosystems are static. Like you could preserve them, like
Right.
you would preserve an artifact in a museum. Forests are extremely dynamic ecosystems. They are changing constantly. They're changing every day, every year. And going back to the many factors behind what we have now as a wildfire, forest health and smoke crisis, is that we have decided over the past 100 years to immediately suppress fires, and then fail to manage the forests after we have stopped after wildfire suppression.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I
What
mean
would be
is,
a good way to manage it after wildfire suppression?
well, my point is that if you're going to, well, let me back up a second. So,
Okay, sorry.
I think most people in all parts of this debate would agree that forests, especially out in the West, probably throughout the country, require frequent low severity fire to maintain those ecological functions and to
Yeah, most of
assure
your
that
species are fire
forest.
propagating out there. All
Yeah,
your ponderosas, your lodgepoles, they're all fire propagating species. Sure.
yeah. My point is that a century of wildfire suppression, followed by nearly 50 years of forest non-management, has contributed to a unnaturally overstocked forests that are packed, with dense trees that are simply not natural.
Not
And
healthy.
so the attitude that these are static ecosystems, we could preserve them like we would in a museum, kind of disregards the dynamic nature of these forests. And active forest management, which really covers a suite of science-backed tools, such as mechanical treatment, prescribed fire, tools that land managers can use to meet certain objectives on a landscape, allow us to mimic those low severity disturbances in a way that allows these forests to continue to thrive and maintain its ecological forests and continue to provide all the benefits that we as human beings and wildlife depend on from these landscapes.
Sure, sure. So I'm curious, and what you talk about, like the densely packed, unnatural nature of this, and it is, well, from my perspective, from a wood lumber perspective, it produces really poor lumber too. Proper management, that's how we get good boards in the first place. These little, scraggly things that are barely clinging to life are not getting enough light, are not getting enough nutrients, not to mention they're being, consumed by, beetles and things like that, because the beetles are not going, well, maybe they are going after healthy trees, but the healthy trees are actually fighting them off. The beetles are winning because the trees are weak already. But what I find interesting is like, I was in South Dakota very recently, and I was out in Custer State Park, and you're driving along, and on the one side of the road, you can see an actively thinned, actively managed forest, and the proof of it is this enormous pile of brush that you can see they've cleaned it out. And park-like is a perfect, I never heard that before, but that's exactly it. You said that. I was like, that's what it looked like. It was this beautiful park-like setting. The other side, I'm hopeful that they just hadn't got to it yet. I mean, it was still within the state park, but you could see how, like, throw a match and it would have gone up. Like, you could look at it and go, ooh, that doesn't look good, but you kind of had to have literally one side of the road managed, one side of the road, we'll just say not managed yet. They hadn't gone through and thinned it yet. And the difference was so stark, and it was so very obvious that the thick stuff was, well, hopefully they're going to do something about that. Because the other aspect is you're in Custer State Park, so everywhere you look there's a buffalo. They're crossing the road. The wildlife couldn't actually move through that. It was so choked. Squirrels could, I suppose. I suppose if a buffalo wanted to, he could push his way through there. But I have to imagine it's not just us and growing pretty trees to make boards, but the rest of the ecosystem in the fauna would be dramatically affected by that, by just a choked out forest with so much density there.
Right. And so what's important to understand is that, we have these unnaturally dense, overstocked forests, which make them highly vulnerable to bugs, beetles, and then disease. All of that combines to increase tree mortality, i.e. dead trees. And what are dead trees? They're fuel. They're wildfire fuel. Yeah. And so we have what one prominent ecologist in the Pacific Northwest has described it. We have an epidemic of dead trees across the West, which has been impacted by wildfire, insects and disease, drought, climate change absolutely is a factor. And so we have an epidemic of dead trees. We have an overabundance of fuel out there on these landscapes. Another way to think about it is, look at the fire triangle. What are the components of the fire triangle? It's oxygen, it's heat, and it's fuel. What is the one component that we can control whatsoever, right? It's the fuel.
Yeah.
You take away the fuel, that tends to modify the behavior of a fire. And so if we can use active forest management tools to keep forests healthy and to reduce fuels, then we could begin to bend the curve of a naturally severe wildfire and smoke that we're dealing with today.
Sure. Now, how does in active management, this is a bit of a right field question, but something you said earlier brought this up in my mind. The whole idea of greater diversity and speciation versus monoculture. When I look at like truly actively managed, like by Weyerhaeuser, Michigan comes to mind as I drive through just south of the Upper Peninsula. Upper Michigan, is that what we call that? I don't know. It's not Upper Peninsula, but and you can literally drive along and see the forests, stair stepping, and they're broadcast seeding, and you're getting this entire however many acres is 3 feet tall, and then boom, it's 6 feet tall, and then boom, it's 12 feet tall. And they're all similar age, but in many instances also similar species. Now they're growing those like fields of corn. They get to a certain age or certain diameter and they're cut for pulp. They're cut for 2x4s. And I've talked on this show about how people complain about, oh man, old 2x4s were beautiful and these tight growth rings. And I have to explain to them that structurally they're not as strong. And I would much rather have a forest grown to make 2x4s instead of cutting down a forest and cutting a bunch of 2x4s out of a larger trunk. Like, let's grow trees for 2x4s. But that does tend to yield a, similar age, similar species, which kind of flies in the face of a healthy forest. And how do we rationalize that, I guess?
Well, going back to what is healthy forest and what is active forest management. Active forest management is the use of tools that are used to meet certain objectives on the landscape. And so, forestry on industrial timberlands is naturally going to be different than forestry on public lands, national
Right.
forests.
Right.
Um,
Do you happen to know offhand, like, what percentage of American forests are public lands?
I don't have that offhand, but it's
That's
very
fine.
substantial. Here in my home state of Oregon, I can tell you that 61%
Hmm.
of the forests in Oregon, we're a heavily forested state.
Sure.
61% is owned by the federal government, managed by federal agencies.
I would imagine at least 3/4, like nationwide, would be
Yeah.
public. Anyway, that's
Well, obviously, when you get past, when you get into Colorado and
mhm,
head west, it's predominantly under federal ownership.
right.
But getting back to this, discussion over, plantations versus natural forests, it really comes down to, what the objectives of of a given landscape is.
Sure.
The difference, especially here in the West, is you have in the Pacific Northwest where you have large amounts of industrial timberlands, almost literally checkerboarded with federal lands, which are dramatically different
Yeah.
when you drive through them. Um, they can all burn. All of these forests, these different types of forests can burn.
Yeah.
The
We're putting
difference
lines
is
on the map again, in other words.
the difference is how they're managed.
Sure.
A lot of people have asked me over the years is, I grew up here. I don't remember these large fires. I don't remember entire summers where I'm just choking on smoke. What has changed? And this applies to the discussion over these different types of forest management regimes is that on industrial timberlands, they are intensively managed. They are pre-commercially thinned. They use all of the science and tools on the table in order to grow quality forests quickly, so that they have that raw material to make the product. There's a lot of access
Hmm. Yeah.
on
Yeah.
these private forest lands, on private forest lands. There is decreasing access to public lands. Every year, the Forest Service, I read, decommissions, I think, 1,100 miles of forest road every year.
Hmm.
The difference is that when there are fires on these private lands, firefighters get in there, they knock them down before they can grow into big infernos. Without that access on public lands, there are a lot fewer opportunities for firefighters to get into these landscapes and to control these fires before they could grow into unnaturally severe infernos.
Right.
And so I think that's a big factor, and that's something when we talk about wildfire, we need to be looking at forest management, because that includes road building and access, to give, not only to give access to the American public to their public lands,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is to
sure. From
give
a recreation
firefighters
perspective, yeah.
it is to give firefighters better and safer opportunities to address these fires.
It's actually a really kind of clear point because, and I'm going to go to the other side of the country at this point. I was up in Maine very recently and wandered into a bike shop, and the guy's like, "Oh man, you wouldn't believe the amount of gravel roads and things because the Forest Service keeps decommissioning all these roads, and where you were kind of." It was okay to ride your bike on it. It was taking your life into your hands because these logging trucks were rolling through, and there's no shoulder. So now suddenly the state of Maine is like so excited about all of the mountain biking and gravel biking opportunities out there. So I went out riding, and I hadn't even thought about it. That's all stuff that is getting overgrown. It's not being managed anymore, and it's turning into like this great single track trail, but give it 5 years and that single track trail might actually be gone. And yeah, that's, and I was actually talking to, a Sawyer who was a fourth or fifth generation. His dad was a lumberjack and his grandfather was a lumberjack. And he's the first one to, as he put it, come out of the forest and work in the city. I don't know whether that was a city in Maine, but he was running a sawmill at that point. And he said it had gotten, the access was such an issue that they actually couldn't make money anymore. It was so hard to actually get to, and it was an active concession. So it wasn't like just go to the first tree. It's like, we need to get to that tree over that hill on this section of the map. And it was so expensive just to go in and get to the trees, and then so expensive to get it out. And of course, you can't just like tromp into the forest. There's regulations, what's the word I'm looking for? Like non-damaging the forest as you're felling the tree. And he had basically just gotten out of the business. The answer was it was too cost prohibitive. He couldn't make a profit on anything anymore, so he stopped doing it. And whether somebody took his place, I don't know, but that's another person that was upstream from my perspective in the supply chain that was no longer producing logs because he actually just couldn't get to them anymore, which is really kind of interesting. Underscores what you're saying.
I think that the access issue is one of the least reported and least discussed part of the forest management debate, and what a big factor is. Those who have worked in forestry for a while now have probably heard about the roadless rule that was implemented by Bill Clinton, back towards the end of his second term, which unilaterally and by administrative fiat set aside tens of millions of acres of public land from certainly any type of management, but basically severely reduced access and the ability to build and maintain roads on public lands. And I think there's a very harmful legacy of the roadless rule. One being is that it has denied many Americans the ability to enjoy their public lands, but it has also significantly made forest management on federal lands infinitely more difficult. I've seen a statistic, so hopefully your listeners won't criticize me if I just get this number wrong, but I had heard that since the Clinton roadless rule was implemented, 36 million acres of forests have burned since that policy was put in place. And so, once again, if we're not able to manage forests, if we're not able to access these landscapes to manage forests, if we're not giving firefighters better and safer opportunities to contain fires before they burn out of control, we're going to have millions and millions of acres of forests, grasslands and others completely burn up. And it becomes very difficult through arbitrary policies to really address this crisis.
Wow. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of barriers out there, but let's see if we can't kind of land this plane with some positive stuff. What do we do? What is our plan from here? And more importantly, to my audience, like, what does the average Joe do to help? I mean, we can send money to organizations like yours, but what else is there? What else can we do? And what should we be doing? That's a two-part question. Well, I realized there.
Yeah. Well, remember at the towards the beginning of the podcast, I had mentioned that, forest policy is not based in science or really, frankly, politics. What's right for the land. It's all based in politics. And, unfortunately, forest policy has trended towards kind of partisan lines often. And that's unfortunate. But I think what the average Joe can do, and what I think makes the biggest difference, is send an email to your member of Congress. Go to a town hall and ask your representative at the state and federal level. It's like, well, what can we do about restoring the health of our forests and reducing the risks of these severe wildfires? When elected officials are hearing from their constituents about issues that are important to them, politicians tend to react to that.
Sure.
And as I've seen, I don't want to take all of the credit. Maybe I'll take some of the credit, but what healthy forests, healthy communities, really tried to do was to connect concerned members of the public with policymakers, whether in Congress or at the land management agencies, to give them a platform to say, hey, we've got a problem, we need solutions, and we need action. And what I'm finding is as more and more people do that, we are seeing more progress. Just in the past couple of weeks, we've seen what I think is a very valuable piece of legislation. It's called the Fix Our Forests Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation, co-sponsored by Bruce Westerman, the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, a forester, and Representative Scott Peters from San Diego. Not a lot of forests in San Diego, but he will tell you that, he breathes the smoke, he sees the wildfire. He understands that our system of federal land management is broken, particularly the cost and time it takes for federal land management agencies to meet federal environmental regulatory requirements and so forth, where it is so bad. In the screenshot, there's Scott Peterson making some extremely good comments. That basically we have a litigation-driven process. All of this to say is these are all political decisions, and to whatever extent people in the industry, people in communities can help policymakers make that connection, the more progress we will see. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. So here's, and this is a difficult question. Very early on, I was saying, as fires are certainly making news. Fires are affecting people, and it's really easy for constituents who lost something or had their aunt lost something to reach out. While certainly we have our share of wildfires out east, it's not nearly the issue that you face out west. And it does seem that every single time I have a conversation like this, it tends towards western forests. How does this differ on my side of the Mississippi? I've got mostly hardwood forests here, and there is it's interesting because you were talking about how it does seem that people are more open to having these conversations on your side of the Mississippi. On this side, it's leave it alone. old growth, don't cut anything down. And meanwhile, they've got the emerald ash borer, like practically the ash is going the way of chestnut. I've got thousand canker taking out walnuts left and right. I've got powder post affecting my oaks all over the place. Maples seem to be doing okay, but I mean, we're going to end up with a bunch of maples. How do we, and I guess that's the point I'm trying to make is we've got this awful catalyst of fire that's pushing people, spurring people to action. But I don't really have that same thing. I mean, certainly there are wildfires that happen in New York, that happen in Canada and things like that. But how do you see this equation changing on our eastern hardwood forests? Because they're dense. Let me tell you, they are dense.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a Westerner, it's hard for me to answer that question. But from my point of view, it's like what really struck me was last year when Washington D.C. was shrouded in wildfire smoke for quite a while, and I saw a noticeable uptick in congressional discourse about wildfires, and so of course a lot of that wildfire smoke in Washington D.C. I think was coming from Canada. But in my work, I come across a lot of people from the East. One forester in New Jersey emails me a lot, and he has been describing many of the same conditions that he's seeing in forests in New Jersey. And I think just recently they had a very big fire there.
They did.
The problem is that, as the climate changes, as we continue to move forward with a passive approach towards land management, this number one, this problem is not going away, and number two, it's going to get worse.
Right.
And so, when it's talking about those unnatural conditions, in New Jersey, I hear a lot from folks in the hunting and outdoors community about the shift towards emphasizing old growth forests. What that is resulting in is a severe deficiency in younger forests that many wildlife species that depend on. Sure. And so, that is driving a lot of the conversation on the east side of the Mississippi. The bottom line is that, yeah.
I think the upshot is it's no different. I mean, the obstacles, the barriers, the threats might be slightly different. I mean, fire affects everything. And I think your point is, this sounds so ominous, but the fire's coming. Like, we have seen more fires out east, but there's other things at the rest of the ecological system. I'm going back to Michigan again, but the jack pine warbler that almost went extinct because they were letting all these old growth trees, and the warbler needed a younger tree to nest under. Mm-hmm. And when we let them all just get old and tall, there was no nesting ground for the warbler and almost went extinct. And that's one of the National Forest Service and the Audubon Society's like greatest case studies right now, is we've rescued the Kirtland's warbler from extinction due to proper forest management. The same type of thing, we hear these little things in New Jersey. I hear them in North and South Carolina. You hear them in Florida all the time. Somebody's nesting ground has been taken away because we just let the forest alone. So it's a slightly different conversation. Forest thinning may not be the solution, although probably should be in some areas. I guess my point, and you kind of backed me up, is what I was hoping is, you may not have fires knocking on your door in New Jersey or where I am in Maryland, but this is something you need to be very concerned about. And it's time to, I don't know, grassroots, take action, write somebody, talk to somebody.
Well, another issue that brings us all together, frankly, is the issue of climate change. And I think everybody who works in forestry, wood products sector has to embrace the fact that we have a really good story to tell about being a solution to climate change. So, One thing that we haven't even talked about on this podcast is the fact that wildfires are a significant source of carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
It's all
in
sequestered. It
Western
gets released.
in Western states, California, Oregon, certainly research that I have seen is that, in these really bad wildfire years, wildfires are throwing up more carbon than, a state's transportation sector. And so, if we really want to, think globally and act locally, forest management is a solution in that we could use science, we could use these science-backed tools to reduce the risks of severe wildfire, and we can reduce the risks of these major carbon emission events. And we can maximize the ability of these forests to sequester and store carbon. I think that's something that people from Seattle to New York City can rally around. But
Sure.
one of the, for a lack of a better term, byproducts of that effort to improve the health of our forests is we have wood fiber, which can help us create the most sustainable, renewable building material that exists. The only building material where half of its dry weight is carbon, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so what we can do is we can take advantage of the carbon storage potential of wood products. We can take advantage of the carbon sequestration benefits of younger forests through the continuous cycle of forestry. We can effectively move towards net zero emissions in a way that really moves the needle on issues like climate change.
That's fantastic. That could not have summed this conversation up better with that. I've had guests in the past where we've talked a lot about the urban canopy and urban logging and the circular economy that results from managing our urban forests, promoting, carbon sequestration, certainly combating greenhouse effects, but then also producing fiber that is then used in that home that's being built down the street. And the downstream effects of that from an economic perspective are enormous. We're doing good for the environment, and you can actually make money doing it at the same time. I know that sounds horribly capitalist, but let's be real. The minute that we leave the forest alone and say don't touch them, then the motivation is, ooh, it's pretty. And I'd love to think that we were all that noble. But the fact of the matter is, and this extends beyond our borders. This is something that I deal with my exotic material day in and day out. The minute you ban a species, now this guy who's in a jungle somewhere who's just trying to feed his family has no way to make money anymore. So that land goes to cattle grazing because now it's worth something, because the mahogany trees on that plot of land can no longer be cut down. And now you can make money for cattle grazing. And that's the unfortunate story there is, managing the forest is not don't touch it. And we see that globally, not just here in the United States.
Well, I think it could be described as a win-win-win situation, a win-win-win solution in that we manage the forests, we keep them healthy, we're able to use that renewable green material that stores carbon for generations, and we can reduce net carbon emissions, we can reduce the risks of severe wildfire. Those of us out west don't have to endure every summer choking on smoke.
Right.
If we decide to arbitrarily draw lines on a map and decide not to do anything, we do not get any of those benefits.
Agreed. That's fantastic. Nick, I cannot thank you enough for taking some time to talk to me today. Here's your last chance to pitch your work. How can people find you? How can people get in touch with you? Tell us where to find you.
You can catch us at healthyforest.org. We offer quite a lot. You could be one of the 260,000 folks that follow us on Facebook. You can be one of the admittedly much smaller audience that follows us on Instagram, but a lot of good stuff on there. We offer a daily forestry news service that you could subscribe to. That's free. We've got a newsletter. My day job is I'm public affairs director for the American Forest Resource Council, that represents the manufacturing and logging infrastructure out here on the West. They have an incredible newsletter. If you want to geek out on forest policy, check that out. And they're also on social media. So a lot of ways to really get plugged into the forest management debate and get involved.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate your expertise and kind of shining a light on some of this stuff. I think the good news is a lot of stuff that, like we've said, people are talking about. This shouldn't really be news to anyone, but it's a great way to just kind of pull it together and crystallize it in people's minds. It's something we need to be aware of, and it's only good to continue to manage this. So thank you for fighting the good fight. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.